Let's go in the talking room.
After devouring The Martian in one sitting and then listening to it as an audiobook, I couldn't get Andy Weir's exhaustively researched debut novel out of my head. I sat down with Andy to talk about how he constructed a gripping science fiction yarn while keeping it firmly rooted in science fact.
If you're familiar with the movie,
Yeah.
you know the sound of Bowman breathing. Yeah, these things they're actually Velcro like the originals. But here's the best part. Put it on, and what you'll hear is that they had to have recorded the audio from the inside of the actual helmet.
Oh, here, hang on my glasses.
There you go.
Thanks.
And if you breathe, you just hear that sound, and it sounds...
That is cool.
It sounds just like the film.
I wonder if the mic's picking it up. I could maybe do that. That is awesome.
Isn't that
you
great?
really get that feeling.
Yeah.
It's like Kubrick put one on at some point and said like, oh, I want to hear this, and I want them to hear this.
It's just like him to do precisely that, right? Andy, thank you so much for joining us on The Talking Room.
Thanks for having me.
I barely know where to begin. I loved this book so much that immediately after reading it, I listened to it. I listened to the audiobook just to get the whole experience again. And it doesn't diminish at all upon a second reading. I plan to read it a third time.
Thanks.
Talk to me about the genesis of this book. Where did it come from?
Well, I'm kind of a dork, and so I really like to sit around and think about the space agency and space program and manned and unmanned space flight. And I was sitting around thinking, how could we do a manned Mars mission like with the technology we have right now? Like, so what would it entail? How do you get people to Mars? How do you get them to the surface? How do you get them back up? It takes a lot of delta V, and you don't want to be, you need to have a ship that can support people for months at a time, but at the same time you need to land on Mars and come back. And so I was working all that. And
now, how were you working that? Were you reading books about NASA? Were you talking to NASA engineers? Were you?
Nope, this is just me sitting around by myself. This is before I even decided to write a book.
Okay.
This is just me sitting around daydreaming, going like, how would a manned Mars mission work? And I came up with what's basically the Ares missions as described in there. And to be fair, I should point out that's about 95% Mars Direct by Robert Zubrin. Right? I made some change.
Explain what Mars Direct is.
Okay, the concept behind Mars Direct is Zubrin's concept was you send a ship to Mars, and then on Mars you make fuel using the Martian atmosphere and other. It's called in situ resource utilization. You basically make fuel there.
Okay, and that saves a tremendous amount of payload in terms of getting some stuff there.
Right, and his idea was that you would send people there in one ship, and you would have a ship there in advance, and it makes fuel, and you send them back in that ship. That's roughly what Zubrin's idea was. But he came up with that before ion engines existed. Ion engines are real technology. They're not just invented for the book. Basically, they're particle accelerators that shoot argon out very, very fast. So fast that the particles gain relativistic mass.
Wow.
Yeah. So that means with less matter, you're getting more momentum change. So you need very, very little reactant mass to get a good distance going.
And this means that it accelerates very slowly but consistently over a long
very long time. And you need a lot of energy to do that. So you'd need a reactor aboard, which my fictional ship has. And then you accelerate. Hermes, as I designed it, can accelerate at 2 millimeters per second. So that's like about as my hands coming apart at that rate would be like. That's the acceleration.
Faster, but that's okay.
And it would get going faster and faster. Now, if you do that for months, you get a pretty good head of steam.
Now, just what's ahead of how much?
You end up going very fast.
like tens of thousands of miles per hour?
Well, I think of it in terms of kilometers per second.
Okay.
You need a delta V of about 5 kilometers a second to put yourself on a Mars intercept. Or actually, you need a delta V of 2.5 kilometers a second, which is 2,500 meters per second, which is about 5,000 miles an hour.
Okay, wait, what's a delta V?
Delta V. Everything you do in space, because you don't have any ground or air or anything to push against, it all comes down to delta V. You want to go to the moon, you're going to need to pick up enough velocity to escape Earth's gravity and get to the moon's gravity area.
I see.
And you need a certain amount of velocity to do that, and there's no way around it. You can't cheat the system in any way. Physics demands that you pay the price, and you have to have this delta V.
Okay.
Everything comes down to delta V, and the amount of fuel you have on your ship determines the total amount of delta V you can have, period. So like the Curiosity probe that we sent to Mars, it had a certain amount of possible delta V that it could do for everything related to the trans-Mars injection burn, which is where it left Earth's gravity well and started on its trip to Mars. And then another burn to slow it down so that it fell into Mars's orbit. And then the insertion burn, the EDL burn, entry, descent, and landing, where it came in, slowed itself down enough that it could get caught in Mars's atmosphere and land. All of the delta V, there was a certain maximum amount of velocity change that it could do during that entire trip. And those things need to be under that. If there'd been an error that was more than their delta V could counter, then they would have failed.
Okay, so I'm going to go back even further.
Okay.
Are you an engineer by training?
Well, I'm a computer programmer by training.
Okay.
But I've always been deeply interested in space travel, and I especially like orbital dynamics.
Since when?
Since all my life.
Since all your life?
Yeah.
So this is like for a hobby?
My dad is a particle physicist.
Oh, okay.
So I
okay.
mean, I grew up with this stuff.
So work it out on a napkin is a genuine family value.
Oh, sure. And he would always encourage me to do all this stuff. And my mom, an electrical engineer, also encouraged me to, although I'm terrible at that. So I'm awful at electronics. I can't do it at all. I'm also pretty bad at chemistry. So everything in the book that had to do with electronics and chemistry was tons of research for me.
Okay.
The physics was also a lot of research, but I started with a fair amount.
But it grows just out of a deep hobby and being able to understand this stuff. And so is the book the end result of an exercise? The book is the end result of an exercise in your head of like, how would this be possible and what would happen?
Well, yeah. So I was basically saying, okay, how would we put together a Mars mission the way I want to do it? And so I figured out, oh, this is how the Mars mission would go. Then you need to start thinking about, this is a manned mission. So you can't just have a failure kill the crew. You have to say, what happens if this fails? How do you ensure the crew survives? How do you abort at this point in the mission? How do you abort here? How do you make sure they survive?
So in each of these things, you're trying to think like NASA would think in terms of worst case scenario planning.
How do we make sure that the crew doesn't die?
And you're going through space history to see how NASA solved these types of problems in the past?
Sure,
okay.
Absolutely. And also, the fun part is thinking of like, this is a problem that's never been solved. What can I do to make sure it gets solved? What if they have to abort when they're halfway to Mars? What if they have some critical failure on their ship? Well, is there an orbital trajectory that just brings them back to Earth fairly quickly without ever going to Mars, et cetera? So I was working on all that, and I thought of all these things that could go wrong on the surface. This could break, that could break. These two things could break at the same time. How do we deal with that? Right. And then I started to realize the increasingly desperate solutions. I'm like, well, theoretically, they could survive if they did this and that. And I realized that makes for a pretty interesting story. So I created a poor hapless main character and subjected him to all of them.
Wow. And you said in one interview that he's basically you?
He's basically, so his personality is all of my good parts and none of my bad parts.
Sure.
Right. So we've all got good traits and bad traits. I've got plenty of downsides that I did not put into Mark.
Did you set out when you wrote this? The thing that I found most exciting about it was it might be the first science fiction, and I'm not even sure this qualifies as science fiction because everything in it is pretty much doable with today's technology. Did you set out to make it all absolutely that way? Or, I mean, was a challenge like, I don't want to make any leap of technology to something that's not currently feasible?
Yes, basically. I did want to make it as scientifically accurate as possible. So all of the technology that you see in the book actually exists. However, some of it is better than our current incarnations. So we don't have ion engines anywhere near as powerful as Hermes has, but there's nothing preventing us from making it. It's just like, I don't know, how do I put it? If we wanted to, we could make an aircraft like 4 times the size of a CA5A Galaxy and make it functional. Right. We haven't, but we know how to do that.
Right, okay.
And so we could scale it up. There are a couple of hand-wavy places in the book where I sacrifice scientific accuracy for narrative.
Is one of them the spacesuits themselves? Because I felt like the spacesuit technology,
you're a spacesuit guy.
I am a total spacesuit guy, and I'm thinking they're not that easy to move around in.
So to make those of you watching this jealous, I'm going to get to see his toys after this, and you don't. Yeah. And I know you have a reproduction Apollo spacesuit. Or at least you did.
I do.
So I'm interested in that.
Yeah. It's pretty crunchy compared to my other stuff.
Yeah, well, it sounds awesome. And I want to see it. But So his spacesuit is like kind of a next-gen spacesuit. One thing that, as a spacesuit buff, I'm sure you know, is that it's practically impossible to put on a spacesuit by yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a scenario where they design spacesuits that can be put on by themselves. And I figured their reasoning behind it was for just such an occasion. They go like, well, we have a crew of 6, they're on Mars, they're not always gonna all be together.
Right.
They're gonna go off and do sample missions. Something could happen. We need one guy to be able to suit up by himself.
It makes all sorts of sense to have that be a thing. I built a glove box last year at negative 3.5 psi with a glove inside it, and that thing is and I had 3 bolts of different sizes with 3 nuts in the box, and all you have to do is thread the nut onto the bolt, and it's exhausting.
It's very hard.
It's really, really difficult.
Oh, it's negative. Oh, I see. So you're feeling the resistance of the gloves.
Exactly.
And stuff. Oh yeah. No,
one, and it's just one glove.
One
it's
glove,
right up to here, and you kind of get this thing up and
huge
put it
amount of
on
work.
there. It's crazy. So you posit here that they've mostly fixed the difficulty of moving around and of putting it on by yourself.
Right. And that I mentioned in the book, and that's another case where I'm a little hand wavy about it. It's like, oh, he can bend down, he can kneel down without too much trouble. If you ever watch the Apollo astronauts, they're trying to reach down with these little like grabber stick things, and then they stumble and fall over. And so I'm assuming that close to 100 years of technological advancement since the Apollo days should be sufficient.
Okay. Oh, so is that what you're thinking, that this might be about 40 or 50 years in the future?
Actually, no. So I'll tell you. I'll show it to you. I'll show it to you later. I can show you a video that I posted online. But I actually calculated the orbital trajectories that they take to get from Earth to Mars and from Mars back to Earth, and all the stuff that happens.
You wrote a program.
I wrote
to
software to
calculate
do
the
this.
orbital mechanics.
Yeah, because a constantly accelerating craft, you can't just, or I certainly can't just calculate with math. I need to make a simulation. I was getting stuck on the math. I'm like, okay, I know exactly how to calculate orbits just from a point thrust. In other words, you get a change in your velocity, and now you're just moving around the sun.
Right.
But I could not, for the life of me, figure out the math behind constantly accelerating trajectories. I'm like, this is hopeless. And so I went online and, of course, tried to figure out, well, how do people do it? How does NASA do it? And the answer is always simulation. They just do simulation with like smaller and smaller time slices and supercomputers. So I figured, well, lives aren't actually depending on my work, so I can be really inaccurate. Like So if
Did it occur to you to call NASA and ask for their help?
Well, I had no contacts with the aerospace industry at all.
I can't believe that
I do
is
now.
maybe the most surprising. I figure we're getting to that. Yeah. But that's one of the most surprising things I find about this book, is that this is all research you've done without talking to NASA engineers. I'm gobsmacked by that.
I really enjoy doing research. I enjoy doing the science and sitting down and doing the math. It's like, that's fun to me.
Okay, but in looking through the history of NASA, is your reference library like 20 books or 100 books or 500 books?
It's one computer,
So you're just looking through.
I just Google around to find what I want and make sure I get good sources instead of Bob's space page. Well, sometimes the best sources.
Bob's space page has amazing stuff on it. I've been there.
Sometimes those are the best things. I found one thing, like most of the stuff I learned about orbital trajectories and calculating stuff like that, I learned from this. I wish I could remember the name, because I would love to give him the credit, but it's this high school teacher who had posted this stuff on a website for his students to look at and say, let's say you want to calculate this delta V from Mars. And I'm like, that's how I learned how to do it, because this guy bothered to post it. But anyway, so I made this simulation. Yeah. And so naturally, I had to have a launch window. I needed to know the locations of Earth and Mars, right? And so there are lots of launch windows. Earth and Mars have concentric orbits, but Mars's is much more eccentric. So if you look at Earth and Mars, their orbits together is like Earth is a circle and then Mars is more elliptical. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really fat distance here and a really thin distance on this side. And
the variance between their apogee and perigee, is that the way you describe it?
Yes.
Excellent.
Excellent, yes.
I'm glad I remember a couple of things from high school.
Yes. The ratio of, the ratio of the long axis of the ellipse to the short axis of the ellipse is the eccentricity.
Okay.
And an eccentricity of 1 means you have a perfectly circular orbit. Earth's orbit is very close to 1. Mars's is a little more eccentric, although still pretty close to 1.
Okay.
Now, so I had to calculate this trajectory where you have Earth moving, Mars moving, and then my ship trying to match speeds and location with Mars.
So
right?
did you choose a year then?
I had to choose a date. I had to choose a specific date. So for any day, and I'm not going to reveal it because I may someday have a contest where I might have people like from clues in the book, I want you to figure out the launch date of Ares 3. But
this is so great. This is exactly the kind of level of detail I go into with my projects.
well, it's because of plot reasons, their originally scheduled mission has to overlap Thanksgiving.
Right.
So I had to choose a launch date such that they would be there on Thanksgiving of that year, and Thanksgiving floats around, so that's kind of a pain in the ass too.
Did you build a program for that?
No, what I did was I figured out for an angle delta between Earth and Mars.
Right.
So I figured it out, basically how to get that trajectory, and then I can kind of rotate both Earth and Mars around in their orbits such that their angle difference is the same, and then I can adjust it a little bit as needed to deal with the eccentricity problems. And so I found out, okay, like when are Earth and Mars this angle distance apart? And I had this list of candidates. And so I'm like, okay, well, that one would not put them there on Thanksgiving. That one does put them there on Thanksgiving, but it's not for 200 years. Okay, this one, and so on. And I finally found one.
Okay, so you first wrote this book and you just put it up on your website.
Yep.
For free.
Yep. So I tried for a long time to give this thing away. Just going back in time a little bit further, when I was in my, so I've always wanted to be a writer. That's always been my dream since I was a kid, everything. My dad had, see this collection of books you have. My dad had probably about like two of these shelves high, bookshelf, too wide, sorry, bookshelf packed with 1950s sci-fi paperbacks. Well, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was the 80s, so nothing beyond that. And I would just, pull one out. I'd read it, and when I was done with it, I'd pull another one out. And so I grew up loving classic, like sci-fi. My favorite authors are Clarke, Asimov, Heinlein. And then, I don't know why I keep looking back at your books. I'm expecting to find Dad's collection
poetry
here.
on the left and plays and movie screenplays on the right.
There we go. So I always wanted to be a writer. But I also like eating regularly, and I like having a place to live that is not a cardboard box in an alley, stuff like that. So I'm a computer programmer. I was a computer programmer by trade. I came into some money in my late 20s because I worked for AOL and they laid me off. And they laid me off at a time that forced me to sell my stock options when they were at their peak. So I assure you, I would not have made a wise financial decision if I hadn't been forced to.
Wow.
But so I took 3 years off and I said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be a writer. Okay. So I wrote a book called Theft of Pride, which was actually my second book. There's another book from before. This is my third book. I wrote Theft of Pride. I spent some time writing it and the rest of the time just trying to get it published, trying to get an agent, trying to get a publishers interested. No one was interested. I eventually said, I gave it a try. I don't have to wonder what would have happened, and now I can go back to being a computer programmer. And then the internet started to get more and more popular, and I'm like, I can now write. I can write and have an audience. It's not going to be my profession,
right?
But I can write short stories and stuff like that.
Get feedback and
Exactly. And so I did that for 10 years, just writing things, posting it up there, and slowly accumulating an audience. And so I had thousands of regular readers by the time I started writing The Martian, which helps a lot because that started this word of mouth thing.
These readers, they'd come back to your site and see updates. So you were serializing the writing process?
Yeah, so when anybody who liked my stuff, they could sign up for my mailing list and stuff like that. A few
I don't
years
think
back,
people realize that it has a long and illustrious history, right? like Mark Twain serialized several of his books, and so did Dickens.
Dickens, it was all about the serials. And the Sherlock Holmes stories, Conan Doyle. So anyway, a few years back, I wrote a short story called The Egg, which was really popular, like millions and millions of page views, and people post the entire content. It's 1,000 words long. It's like a page and a half, but people really liked it. It's a good digestible story for the internet era. It's something you can read in 5 minutes and be done with, and people liked it. So that brought a lot of readers to my site. Anyway, The Martian was just one of the things I wrote. It was just like, okay, I'm going to write a serial about a guy trapped on Mars. If you think about it, it is kind of a 1950s serial.
Oh no, it's relentless. Like each thing, you're like, oh my God, this poor guy. Did you put up a chapter at a time?
A chapter at a time. So I'd post a chapter, and then when I was done with the next one, I'd do a brief editing pass, post the next one. I told everyone.
Would fans actually come up with corrections that
Absolutely.
would make it into the manuscript then?
Absolutely, and especially the
man.
scientific accuracy was great. People are like, "Oh, you got the chemistry wrong on this," and I'm like, "Of course I did. I suck at chemistry." And I'm like, "Tell me what I did wrong," and then now all of a sudden I have a subject matter expert to talk to, right? So I posted it chapter by chapter, and I told the fans, I'm like, I want to be clear, this isn't exactly a serial. I reserve the right to go back and make changes to earlier chapters. So this stuff isn't like set in stone canon.
Right.
If I come up with like, ooh, I have a cool plot point here, but I need to set up for it in these previous chapters, I reserve the right to make those changes. And I eventually finished, and I'm like, okay, I'm done. Now on to my next project. And I started to get emails saying like, oh, hey, I really like The Martian, but I really hate reading it in a bunch of web pages. Can you make an e-reader version?
Right.
And I'm like, sure. So I figured out how to do that, and I made an EPUB and a Mobi version and posted it on the site. And I'm like, okay, you can read it in the web pages or you can read it on the e-reader. Knock yourself out. Then I got other emails from people saying, hey, I really like The Martian, and I'm glad that you made it into an e-reader format, but I'm not very technically savvy, and I don't know how to download a random file from the internet and put it on my e-reader. Can you just post it to Kindle, Amazon Kindle, so that I can just push a button on my Kindle and get it? I'm like, okay. And so I worked out how to do that. That turns out it's really simple. They have this thing, Kindle Direct Publishing, KDP, where you just post it up there, you set what you want the price is, set what you want the price to be, set what you want your royalty to be, and then that's it. And so I'm like, oh, no problem. I want the price to be 0, and I want my royalty to be 0. There we go.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, you can't do that.
Really, they don't allow you to make it free.
Right. They're not a free cloud service, right?
Okay.
They want to make money.
Right.
So they make their money off their content. So you must charge at least 99 cents. Well, basically it works out to be the lowest you can set your share to is 30%, and the lowest price you can set is 99 cents. So I'm like, okay, 99 cents. My royalty is 30 big pennies per copy. There you go. So I say, all right, everybody, now you can read it on my website, or you can download it for free for your e-reader here, or you can pay $1 to have Amazon put it on your e-reader for you. Basically, think of it that way. And within a month or two, more people had bought it from Amazon than had downloaded it for free.
That's
Hilarious. That's just
the cost
reach.
of convenience.
Yes, I guess $1 is not a big barrier to entry for a lot of people.
Well, I assume it very quickly started getting reviews on Amazon.
Yes, started getting reviews. It started doing really well, word of mouth, and then it finally made it into the top sellers. And
wow, that's significant.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
Well, I didn't even realize at the time how well it was selling. I was like, it's selling. But I don't know, they have the daily reports and it's like, oh, here's how many copies you've sold. And I'm like, but I don't know what that means. I don't know what good sales are or bad sales or what. And it's like, oh, I'm selling about 300 copies a day. I don't know what that means. And so there's this forum that they had for all the KDP authors where you're automatically a member and you can chat about it and stuff like that. And people are like, oh, today was a great day. I sold 5 copies of my book. I'm like, okay, I think then mine must be selling abnormally well. And then it made it into the sci-fi top 10 and technical top 10 and stuff like that. Once it gets there, then it really spikes because
it makes the front page.
Yeah, people are like, oh, I don't know what I want. What are the top 10 sci-fi? I'll take it. And then from there, that got the attention of Random House, Crown Publishing, which is part of Random House. And they said, they wanted to make a print edition. So there's an editor at Crown named Julian Pavia, and he was like, I want to make a print version of this book. I like it, but I want an opinion from someone outside the company. And so he talked to a colleague of his named David Fugate, and David's a literary agent. And he said, David, I want you to take a look at this and tell me whether you think this is something that is publishable. I want an external opinion. David read it and said, yes, I think it's publishable. Then he came to me and said, do you need an agent? I'm like, yes. And he's like, okay. And he turns around to Julian, let's talk about how much you're going to pay for this thing. Wow. But Julian knew that was a case. I mean, part of the reason Julian talked to David was he goes this guy's going to need an agent.
It's such a great story for being able just to do something and then
without any personal risk, without any personal financial risk. It's not a vanity press or anything.
Right.
Oh, and then that same week that we closed on the book deal, we closed the movie rights deal with Fox. So that was a really eventful week for me.
Wow. And it's currently being made into a movie, right?
Right. In fact,
Ridley Scott, they're filming soon?
Ridley Scott is directing, Matt Damon is starring as Watney. Donald Glover as Rich Purnell, which I'm really excited by because I love that guy.
Rich Purnell is a stone cold rocket man.
Steely-eyed missile man.
Steely-eyed missile. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I mean, I really love Donald Glover.
Yeah. No, me too. Me too. It's the cast
awesome.
sounds great. The only thing I worry about is, well, I'll state this and then I have a question. But I worry they can't fit everything into the book into even a 3-hour movie. I think
you'd be surprised. They did a good job. I've seen the screenplay, or I've seen a version of the screenplay from a long time ago.
Okay.
They're always making changes, and so they're going to send me another one fairly soon for comments and stuff.
Are you going to get to visit the set?
They haven't invited me.
Oh, you should totally go.
Well, so here's another thing people like to point out. So I'm afraid of flying. So I'm actually very much afraid of flying, and so it's being filmed in Budapest. Which
that's a long way to go by boat.
That's a long walk, yeah. And so so I don't know. They haven't invited me, so I don't have to have that existential crisis yet.
Right.
But if they do invite me, then I'm going to have to really think about it.
So we've done stuff here on Tested with Commander Chris Hadfield from the International Space Station. He wrote a blurb for the back of your book.
Yeah, he did. That was exciting.
And Chris is a friend of ours, and I asked him, how did you like the book? And he's like, I loved it. I mean, he was super vigorously enthusiastic about how much he loved it. But I texted him and asked him, do you have any questions
Just now.
if I'm talking to Andy? And he said, wait, where is it? He said, yes. His wife wants to know, what's your next book? But we'll get to that at the end.
Okay.
But he said, how did you get the realistic sense of being an astronaut so right? Does he know any of us?
No, I don't. Not at the time that I wrote the book. Now I have talked to a lot of them. I've gotten emails and gone back and forth with a number of astronauts. I didn't know any at the time. It's just I'm a space dork, so I've seen a million documentaries. If it is a documentary that has anything to do with spaceflight or manned spaceflight, I will watch it.
But the thing that I find surprising about the way you cover the astronauts, and I know that there's lots in the literature of NASA about their evolving understanding of the personality type that makes a good astronaut. Some of the early Apollo missions were evidence of them not getting that right. And yet there is a lot that they keep close to their vest about things that have gone wrong. So it's hard to find those stories. And, I've met a lot of space nuts, but rarely have I come across someone who clearly loves every aspect, from the technology to the engineering to also the psychology. And you get deep into the psychology of the entire Ares crew in a way that I find really fascinating. So all of that's fascinating to you.
It's all really exciting to me, of course. I mean, the people who are doing the manned spaceflight, astronauts are just universally acknowledged as a cut above the rest of humanity. I mean, they're so awesome. And you say what makes a good astronaut, right? And one thing, if you're going to have a mission that's going to take an entire year, from start to finish, you better have 6 people who work together. That's one thing. Is I've never liked it. Well, not never liked it, but I usually don't like it when I'm watching a movie or reading a book and there's a space crew, and they have this tension and these personal issues and stuff like that. And I'm like, no, astronauts are unbelievably professional.
Right. Right. You take the top 0.1% and then shave off 99% of those and you get astronauts.
Right, exactly. And then just, so the things I wanted to do for the crew, as shown in the book, are first off, obviously, everybody's extremely good at their technical skills, right? Everybody knows exactly what they're doing.
Right.
Nothing on the ship catches them off guard. They don't have to try to figure it. They know how everything works.
And that's the way astronauts work.
That's
they
the way
work through
astronauts
every
are.
worst case scenario possible.
Right. Number 2, a very good esprit de corps. They have no personal issues, no arguments or problems with each other. They don't butt heads on anything. They're really professional and they get along very well. And then third, a deep and profound confidence in their commander. So Commander Lewis,
that was pretty impressive.
is nobody ever questions what she has to say ever. And not because they're afraid of her, but just because they respect her that much. And they have complete faith in her. And you need that in a crew of anything from a fishing boat to a spacecraft. So
you had posited the crew and posited Watney. And the book is, I guess, 4 or 5 chapters you spend in the first person, and then we cut to a third person perspective.
Yeah.
Did you know that you were going to do that narratively, or did you come to that I want to talk about what's happening on Earth, how NASA would respond to such a thing?
Exactly. Well, my original plan was, as I started, 'cause I didn't really have a full outline or layout. When I started, my plan was just we're gonna see his log entries from the start all the way to the end. And it's just going to be everything from his point of view.
Right.
But then I realized it's getting progressively less and less likely that NASA wouldn't notice. Right. I mean, and I'm like, they have to notice. And that's interesting. That's something that's cool.
Right.
Is watching an entire space complex go
Right.
like that.
When they see things have moved and things have changed.
And so I realized that it's not like they'd just be sitting around doing nothing. Even if they couldn't communicate with them, they'd be like, can we send a probe with supplies?
Right.
Can we send a radio? Can we do anything to help this guy? And so
even down to some of the institutional mechanics of managers making safe decisions versus dangerous decisions.
Right, they have to juggle the safety of the remaining of the 5 crew that are on their way back from Earth.
Right.
They have to compare that, any risks they're going to take with them versus the risks they want to take to help Watney.
I'm sure that you've read Feynman's analysis of the
space shuttle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just in terms of him talking specifically about the difference between the way the engineers look at risk and the way the managers of the engineers look at risk.
Right. Well, and that the kind of red alert status of this problem gets diminished over time with every level up in management you go. That was his main conclusion.
Right. Yes.
The engineers are like, this is a big problem. Their managers are like, this is a problem. And then those managers are like, we may have a problem. And then those guys are like, there are some problems. But it's
One of my favorite bits in the book regarding Watney's emerging, damn the torpedoes, I can take kind of anything, is when he's on his way to Schiaparelli and he just starts naming stuff after himself. Yeah. Because why the hell not?
Why not? Yeah.
That's again, I wanted to know is as you're writing this, you're putting yourself into Watney's head and you're just thinking, yeah, that's what
would
I
I
do. Right.
Yeah. Well, funny story about that. When I went down to JPL earlier this month and gave a talk there, and that was awesome. It was one of the most awesome days of my life. It's just getting to take a tour of the place, look at the spacecraft assembly rooms, and look at their mission control room. They let me sit at the seats and take pictures, and it was awesome. But after my talk, people came up and talked to me a bit, and one of them was a guy who works in the kind of the graphics department, and JPL has a graphics department and stuff like that, and they'll if they're going to have a meeting about something oh, we're going to have a meeting and we're going to talk about what we're going to do with Curiosity tomorrow.
Right.
And it's a high-level meeting. It's not for the engineers. It's for the managers saying okay, here's a map of the area and here's where Curiosity's going to go. And they have some software that they use to show a map of a region of Mars or whatever and a motion trace and stuff like that. And so he made a map of Mark Watney's movements using that software, and he gave it to me. Oh. And also the map points things out of what they're called and what they're used. And he denoted the Watney triangle.
Yes.
Stuff like that. And that I thought was awesome. Another thing was in the book, there's Watney invents a physical unit called a Pirate Ninja, which is
my son and I bonded over how much we loved Pirate Ninjas as a shorthand for kilowatts per use
kilowatt hours per soul.
Kilowatt hours per
Which
soul.
is, if you do the unit analysis on it, is actually just a power.
Right.
You could just say watts.
Right.
Right. But kilowatt hours per soul is poignant because it's how many can he generate? How much does he use?
Right.
And there's day and night. And they said I had lunch when I was there. I had dinner with a bunch of the Curiosity guys.
Yeah.
And they said we use that. We need to know that all the time. It's just for them. It's watt hours per soul.
Right.
And it's watt hours per soul. Watt hours per soul. So they're they're just saying we should call that a millipirate Newton.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
I found the first person stuff on Mars super exciting and involving. And when we bumped to third person, I remember going, I haven't read a book where we do this. And then realizing what NASA and then the world following NASA would be doing, spending billions of dollars to rescue one guy. Why would you do it? And you talk about that in the book. But I found that whole aspect super moving. In fact, most of the stuff I found arresting and emotional to read was the way Earth would be responding to Watney's ordeal.
Yeah, and I did that on purpose. And the reason why, or my intended reason why you feel that way is because it puts you more empathize with the people who are watching helplessly. Because that's what you're doing as the reader when you're going through Watney's segments. You're helpless. You can't help him.
Right.
But now when you're reading the parts that take place on Earth, you feel like, oh, well, I'm one of these people.
Yeah.
I'm one of the people who is gathered up in Times Square watching the things play out. So you can really feel like you're part of it.
Yeah. Okay, so you write this book, it gets published, it's doing really, really well. You must have, let's go back to the first time a NASA engineer writes to you. It's probably before the book is published, right?
Huh.
Was there somebody who'd worked at NASA that sort of came across the book?
Yeah, I had people who are engineers, scientists, and people who work for NASA or JPL would send me email with either critiques or hey, this is, or just hey, good job.
Yeah.
The ones that I really liked are the ones where they sent hey, you got the math wrong.
Yeah.
Because then I feel really good about it because it's been double checked.
Right, by the best source.
Yeah.
But then, so go ahead.
Oh, there's one scene early on in the book where he's reducing hydrazine.
Yeah,
and so
I love this stuff.
So he's reducing hydrazine to liberate the hydrogen, and then he's burning the hydrogen with oxygen to turn it into water. This does not go as smoothly as he'd like, but
that's putting it mildly.
Point is, he does end up reducing a certain amount of hydrazine and turning it into water over a certain period of time. And I got an email from a chemist saying okay, you did this much hydrazine. You tell me how much hydrazine he changed, how much water he made, which is is correct.
Right.
Right. And he said but you have also in the past told me the atmospheric pressure of the HAB and the general dimensions of the HAB from which I can calculate the volume.
Yeah.
And he's and you told me how long it took him to reduce all this hydrazine. So I know how much, it's extremely exothermic to do that reaction. And from that I can calculate, basically he had enough information to calculate the temperature increase in the HAB that would happen as a result of him doing it over the time specified. Right. And he said you'd go up 400 kelvins. So he would have died. He would have roasted himself alive. And I'm I didn't find out about that until after it was already in print. So I'm well, I can't fix it. There are a million ways I could have fixed that.
Right.
I could say he does it slower over time. He could just bring boulders in from outside and they're giant
so cold,
heat sinks.
Right.
But there are a lot of solutions. But I thought I like this guy. He sat down and did the...
He's just like you.
Yeah, he is.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then the book does really well, and you start getting calls from, I guess, you start moving up through the hierarchy too, right? You get calls from managers and other people at NASA and then astronauts.
Yep.
Have any of those interactions caused you to want to go back and change things that you had originally put in?
No, really not. So 99.999% of the interactions I have with them is just positive feedback.
Yeah.
And I think they're used to reading hand-wavy, silly sci-fi. So just something that takes it seriously at all to them gets an immediate plus 50 points. Yeah.
Hadfield was totally, that was the thing he found the most exciting. He said to me, I ran into him in Sydney, Australia a few months ago, and he said, I want to find out who his source was at NASA because he knows things that are really hard to learn.
I guess that would just be a combination of luck and watching a million documentaries, I guess.
Tell me about the first interaction with an astronaut. That must have been exciting.
So I guess actually the first interaction I had with an astronaut, I wish I could remember his name. He was a space shuttle astronaut. I was really excited at the time, and now I've forgotten his name. But he was oh, hey, I was a space shuttle. And he said oh, I really liked your book and stuff. But just so you know, you can actually bake the CO2 out of lithium hydroxide canisters just by heating it up.
Oh,
and I'm
nice.
I didn't know that. So Mark theoretically, there's this whole part where he has to bring the oxygenator with him on this long trip and stuff like that. And I'm like, if I'd known he could just bake the CO2 out, that would have been much simpler.
That would have been, wow, yeah.
And he's like, but the book's good. I like it. But that was cool. One of the earliest feedbacks I got was from Commander Hadfield because they had sent out an
advanced copy,
an ARC to lots of people, and Hadfield came back with a pull quote right away.
Oh, that's great.
That was so awesome when I heard that. That was exciting. But remember, for me and my dad's bookshelf, the most exciting pull quote for me. No disrespect to Chris Hadfield.
Yeah.
I mean, I was really over the moon about that. But I got one from Larry Niven.
Oh, wow.
That was cool.
Wow.
That was call my dad at 7 in the morning. Like, as soon as I saw that email, I'm like, yeah, that was exciting.
I can imagine. Is anything that now that you are conversing with the very engineers who you've been, representing in the book, do you have other ideas for another space-themed book?
I have ideas for another hard science fiction book. But the problem is I have a really good setting, but I don't have a really good story for it. And I pitched it. I had a story, and I pitched it, and the publisher's like, what else you got? So it's not, which is good. It makes me feel good to know that they're not just going to rubber stamp it.
Right.
So it has to actually be something they think is good.
I worry about that because one of the other things I love about the book is that you repeatedly show the math. Mm-hmm. And I tell this to people, like, he shows the math, and it's still narratively exciting. I don't know how that works because any editor, I would imagine, would be like, "You've got to take that section out of all that math. It's too much."
They loved that. They didn't have a problem with that.
I guess I'm wrong.
Well, not these editors. I guess
Yeah.
they liked it. Although bear in mind, like, I had written the whole book before they'd seen it.
Right.
So the editing process was pretty smooth. It was not a lot of changes at all. Mostly things like, oh hey, here you have a scene that takes place back on Earth, and the NASA guys, and they're all talking, but you never tell me where, you never tell me, are they in a meeting room? Are they on the phone? Are they at a restaurant? Are they at somebody's house?
Oh, right.
It's like, so give me a paragraph up here to set the setting, because I was always like too eager to get into the scene.
Okay, so I have a theory, and I don't think you can probably confirm this theory, but I like it, so I'm going to state it anyway.
Okay, fair enough.
Which is, they're making a movie out of this. I don't think they're going to make an R-rated movie out of this. Even though Watney's language would make the movie a hard R, they're not going to make it a hard R.
Correct.
They're going to make it PG-13.
That's what they're shooting for.
Okay, so if it's PG-13, they
have
get
to
one
dial it back.
F-bomb.
Yep.
I have a theory about where it is.
You're right.
First line.
I don't know if it's the first line, but it's
It's in the very beginning.
yeah. You mentioned like, we get one F word, we're using it in the first 30 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. That's great. I'm glad to know, because it belongs there.
Yeah, his language alone would push it into our territory, but that's okay. They're just going to soften it up a little bit.
Well, and it really, that's one of the things that also feels genuinely real about it, is that when you understand Watney's particular character quirks that make him the ideal member of the crew to go through this ordeal on a whole host of levels. Mm-hmm. Did you try any of stuff like this? Like, did you try growing potatoes or eating them for a bunch of days?
No, I didn't. Although what's funny is there is there's a YouTube video online out there. R.C. Bray, who did the audiobook, who was the narrator of the audiobook.
Who does a wonderful job.
Excellent job.
We talked about it on our podcast.
He's a great voice actor. There's a video of him, like, just trying to eat just raw potatoes. Like, he's just like eating, he's just like, I'm getting into character and stuff like that. He's like, oh, this is disgusting.
Have you had, there must be all sorts of different fan interactions about this. People cosplaying perhaps, or?
Nothing to that level
Nothing
yet.
to that level?
Nothing like that.
There?
I get the occasional like fan art. People will draw pictures. People make videos with like cool CGI like versions of like the Hab and stuff. And
have they done mission patches?
I haven't seen an Ares mission patch. No.
Really?
No, not yet.
Get on that.
Well, I imagine the studio, Fox will make one.
I'm sure they will, yeah. Was there a point at which you're writing these, as you're thinking through the exercise of what could go wrong and how would you fix it, and then what could go wrong and how would you fix it? Were there points where you went to a dead end where you went down a path that was just too difficult to fix, so you
Yes.
backtracked?
Yes, that actually happened a few times. I was like, oh, here's another thing that could happen. And then I'm like, if that happens, how does he get at it? Because I never started with the solution and worked back to the problem. I would always start with the problem
Right.
and say, okay, how does he solve it? And I wanted each problem to come from the solutions to the previous problem. The whole book I wanted to be kind of a cascade failure. I don't want him just to keep getting struck by lightning, just like, oh, can you believe his luck? Oh, now
Right,
this happened.
right.
Each thing kind of I wanted to lead to the next. At one point I considered, when he's on his long drive to Schiaparelli,
Yeah.
I thought, like, what if the RTG develops a problem? What if it leaks or something like that and he has to live without it? And so he like throws it away and he has to drive away without it. There's just no way you survive. It's
Really?
just, you are dead.
Not at all.
You're dead. You will either freeze to death or just not have enough power to make it to your destination in time.
So one of the problems I found most surprising in Watney's execution of a solution was the dust storm. Mostly it was, there's a problem coming. I now understand what the problem is. I'm exhausted. It's been however many hundreds of days on Mars so far. And yet, even despite the exhaustion, it was so astronaut-like him to leave the monitors of the atmosphere 80 kilometers apart to be able to determine which direction the storm was moving in. That is the kind of solution that only a deeply inculcated astronaut of like, this is only one way to figure this out, and it's going to take me 3 days of staying in the same place. That was shocking to me.
Right, because the whole point is like forward progress. And now he's like, God.
Yes, yeah, and he has to backtrack for days in order to figure out whether or not he's making the right forward progress. I mean, is there a history of a certain mission from NASA that helped really inspire or guide your thinking?
Obviously, Apollo 13.
Right.
Right. So Apollo 13 is like, my favorite scene in Apollo 13 is when they're making the CO2 scrubber adapter kit,
Yes.
basically, the mailbox,
Yes.
as it was called, right? That's like one of my favorite scenes of any kind in cinematic history. And so
Mine too.
Yeah. I'm like, so basically I wanted to make a whole book of that.
Yeah.
That's what I was going for. As for other NASA missions, there were a lot of, there were not just NASA, but also the Soviet Space Agency. They had a lot of missions where like, wow, they almost all died.
Do you have an example of
Yeah.
someone that stands out?
Yeah, Gemini, I want to say 8. I might be wrong. But there was a Gemini where it was Neil Armstrong was the pilot. And I don't know who the other guy was, but it'll be somebody famous like Jim Lovell or something. I mean,
There you go.
it'll be one of the Gemini astronauts. But they had basically one of their attitude thrusters turned on and locked on. And it's just like, and so the ship just started spinning and spinning and spinning. And so they're in this wild spin, and it just keeps getting worse. See, it's like Armstrong was a pilot, and he couldn't zero it out because whenever he tried to fight it, he this malfunctioning thruster would keep screwing with it. So it's not like he was in a bad spin and just had to zero it out. It was like it's actively fighting him.
Man.
And so he jettisoned the, basically they were attached, the purpose of the mission was to attach to this other unmanned module and detach and reattach and just test docking. And so he ditched that, and that dumped a lot of his rotational inertia. And then he managed to zero it out and get it so that the ship is just spinning on one axis. Just to spin on one axis and just keep going like that. And so he's like, this we can control. Right, we can. If we're going to spin wildly out of control, we're going to spin wildly in control, and so he got that to zero out, and they were able to get into basically do reentry. And when they detached from that, that's where the bad thruster was the
other module.
Was the other module, so that they detached from it. And it's just like a lesser astronaut, than Neil Armstrong, they would have died. They would have just been dead. And that was just like one of I think that's probably the closest that we came to losing someone in space until
Apollo 13.
Until Apollo 13, would have been closer. Yeah.
Are you to learn that story? Is there an account, or are you reading the actual transcripts of the?
I saw that in a documentary.
Okay.
Yeah, and another one of my just talking about like what astronauts are made of. I love to tell this story. So John W. Young, right? John Young.
Yeah.
He was a Gemini astronaut and an Apollo astronaut. He was the commander of Apollo 16, and he was the first space shuttle commander. Like, this guy is
Bridging
just
whole eras.
astronaut. Right. Okay. He's got a lot of interesting stories to him, but my favorite is Apollo 16 when they're launching. You know, they have biomonitors on, and they monitor, you know, everybody's heart rate and everything, breathing rate, heart rate, blood pressure, everything. Of course, during the launches, everybody's heart rate spikes, right?
Right.
So you go like Apollo 11 when it was launching, Armstrong, Aldrin, Connors, their Collins, sorry, their heart rates like spiked up to 140, 150. You know, a normal resting heart rate's like 60, 70, right? John Young's on the Apollo 16 launch never got above 70. So it's like what your heart rate is right now.
That's what he was pulling, what, 6 Gs?
Just like, and launching on top of a rocket, just like, he's like, So the guy is just, he also had another great expression where he's my favorite astronaut, by the way. He had this great expression where they were talking about stage 1 failure for the space shuttle when they were launching Columbia, the first, you know, STS-1, right?
Yeah.
And they said like, oh, here are all the different things you do during an abort. If there's a problem here, then you glide back here. If there's a problem here, you do this. Well, there's like a stage 1 failure is like when it's like something goes wrong right away, just almost immediately as they're leaving the tower.
Right.
And then the idea is get enough altitude that the orbiter can glide back to safety. And John Young like looked at that and said like, none of these things will work. Like if this happens, we're just going to die. Like if we're not going to get up, we're just going to die. And so, and there's all these procedures and stuff that you should be doing. And he just classified them all as things to keep busy while waiting to die. But
how about the Russian space program? Because I mean, we have lots of information in the U.S. about our own space program.
Right. Well, they had like serious failures. Right. They had on, I think it was Vostok. I forgot the name of it. But one of their missions had a malfunctioning valve that basically let all the air out before it should have.
Wow.
And so the astronauts were inside, not wearing spacesuits, because they could fit 2 suited astronauts or 3 unsuited astronauts in their ship. And this valve popped and let the air out, and they all just died of asphyxiation.
Oh. You're gathering together this information. Is it all in here? Or are you using a program or a set of... What's your organizational philosophy for gathering this to be able to utilize it?
Well, the cool anecdotes, like I was just saying, that's just up here because that's cool. All the math and science, so I had files and spreadsheets. And so, like, I know, like I mentioned, I know, like, what the date was.
Right.
On Mars and Earth and everything. So you'll notice at various times when they're talking to Mars, there's like the transmission delay. Yeah. Well, that's all accurate.
Right.
To where Mars and Earth are. So I had to know like what date.
Oh, the transmission delay changes depending on where Mars and Earth are in relation.
Because we could be very close together or we can be like very far apart.
And that's the difference between what, like 14 minutes and 20 minutes?
I think it can be. I think it can be as high as like 22 minutes and as low as like 5.
Wow.
I don't know. Maybe 5 is. If you're perfectly lined up at the closest point, I'm not sure what it is, but it's some single-digit number of minutes.
So has NASA asked for your help with anything?
No.
No? No. I really feel like they should.
We need a science fiction out there.
Well,
that's right.
You know, I know that at certain points the government contracts people who are creative to help posit worst-case scenarios that their engineers might not ever consider. I would think that you'd be ideal for such a mission.
I would certainly enjoy such a mission, but I find it hard to believe that I would come up with anything that NASA engineers didn't.
I'm also curious about your book. The accuracy in your book is such a key point that is so clear. What did you think of gravity?
Well, okay. So
I'm sure this question's come up before.
It has. So first off, I thought it was cinematically beautiful. Like it was just stunningly beautiful. And I've heard from astronauts that really is what things look like. And so that I really enjoyed it for the artistry and stuff like that. And yeah, there are a bunch of like problems.
Orbital mechanics.
Orbital mechanics problems. You know, it's like the Hubble, ISS, the space shuttle, the Chinese space station are all like right next to each other. Also, the protagonist seeking debris field. You know, it comes around and destroys like the shuttle. Then she goes to ISS, and it comes around and destroys ISS. Why didn't it destroy ISS the first time?
Right.
Okay. Then she goes to the Chinese space station, and then it's coming after her again. And also, if something's going really, really fast, then with respect to you, then it's not in the same orbit.
Right.
Even if you're both going this way, if it's going this way and it's going so much faster than you, then
Right.
it's going to be in a different orbit with a different period.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So
But did that inhibit your enjoyment, or were you
No.
able to just kind of let go?
I can let it go. I can let it go. And I didn't have a problem with any of that. I thought the movie was cool and I enjoyed it. But yeah, it's not physically accurate. But you know what? I also liked the Avengers. You know?
There's like nothing. I watched it again last night just because.
And you know, the Bifrost is, faster than light travel. You can't do that, but I'm not complaining. I like Star Trek too.
Absolutely. Are you writing another book right now?
I am. I'm working on my next book. It's called Zhek, Z-H-E-K. It's a working title. And it's more of a traditional sci-fi. So it's not the rigidly scientifically accurate. It's more soft science fiction. Yeah, like aliens and stuff like that going on.
I can't wait to read it. Andy,
Well,
thank
thanks.
you so much for coming onto the Talking Room. I
Thanks
really
for having me.
appreciate the visit. And this is an amazing book, and we've been saying it for weeks on Tested. Go read it and thank us later.
What he said.
Oh, C.K. Dexter, haven!